Imagine a time when sickness meant more than physical suffering. It meant separation, isolation, and shame. In the dusty streets of ancient Judea, one woman endured 12 years of unceasing pain and social death. Her name, lost to history, but her desperate act of faith would echo through eternity. What extraordinary courage drove this broken woman to defy every social convention of her day? Stay with us as we uncover the astonishing journey of the woman whose single touch changed everything, and discover what her story reveals about the power of desperate faith in our darkest moments. First century Judea was a land of harsh contrasts. Under Roman occupation, the Jewish people clung fiercely to their religious identity, finding refuge in the strict laws that set them apart as God's chosen. These laws, particularly those concerning ritual purity, governed every aspect of daily life. For women, the laws of purity were especially burdensome. A woman with any bleeding was considered ritually unclean. Everything she touched became unclean. Everyone who touched her became unclean. She could not enter the temple, could not participate in religious life, and could not be embraced by family. Now imagine this condition persisting not for days, not for months, but for 12 long years. A sentence of living death, where human touch becomes a forbidden luxury and hope itself begins to bleed away. This was not just a medical condition. It was a spiritual exile, a daily reminder that in the eyes of society, you were less than human, untouchable, unworthy, unclean. And it was in this suffocating atmosphere of religious legalism and social isolation that our protagonist's extraordinary story unfolded. A story that would challenge the very foundations of what it meant to be clean in the eyes of God. She had once been a woman of means, perhaps a merchant's wife or a landowner's daughter. Her home had once echoed with laughter, with the ordinary sounds of a life well lived. But that was before the bleeding began. At first, she believed it would pass, just another monthly cycle extending beyond its time. But days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and months to years. 12 years of constant hemorrhaging. 12 years of growing weakness. 12 years of watching her wealth drain away as quickly as her lifeblood. The Torah was clear. When a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, she shall be unclean. This wasn't merely a suggestion. It was divine law. And so, with each passing day, her world grew smaller. Her husband could no longer touch her. Her children could no longer embrace her. Her friends stopped visiting. Her seat at community gatherings remained empty. What made her story particularly tragic was her relentless pursuit of healing. The physicians of her day practiced medicine that was primitive at best, barbaric at worst. Ancient medical texts prescribed remedies for her condition that included drinking a mixture of wine with alum and crocuses, carrying the ash of an ostrich egg in a linen rag, or being startled suddenly when the bleeding was at its worst. Carry the tooth of a fox, one physician told her. Drink the urine of a donkey mixed with cypress oil, insisted another. Each cure more degrading than the last. Each failure more devastating. Each payment depleting what little resources she had left. The Gospel of Mark tells us plainly, she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. Unlike the religious leaders who basked in public admiration or the wealthy who enjoyed social privilege, she had become invisible, a shadow person existing on the margins of society. Yet beneath her worn exterior burned an inextinguishable spark of faith that would soon ignite into a flame bright enough to catch the attention of the divine. The whispers began like most rumors in small villages, quietly at first, then spreading like wildfire through the countryside. Stories of a rabbi from Galilee who taught with unprecedented authority, of a prophet who commanded unclean spirits and they obeyed, of a healer whose touch restored the leper's flesh and made the paralyzed dance. Jesus of Nazareth. Each account she heard kindled something dangerous within her chest. Hope. Dangerous because hope, after 12 years of disappointment, was more painful than resignation. Yet she could not extinguish it. One evening, as she applied fresh bandages to absorb her endless flow of blood, her elderly servant burst through the door, breathless with excitement. "He's coming. The healer from Nazareth. He's coming to our town tomorrow." Her heart raced, but doubt immediately cast its familiar shadow. What made her think this healer will be different from all the others? And even if he could heal, why would he touch someone like her? Unclean, untouchable? Sleep evaded her that night as questions battled within her mind. By morning, a radical thought had taken root. Perhaps she didn't need him to touch her at all. "If I just touch his clothes," she whispered to herself, "I will be healed." The audacity of this thought startled her. To touch a holy man while unclean was to defile him, a serious violation of the law. If caught, she faced not just public humiliation, but possible stoning. The risk was immeasurable. But what choice did she have? 12 years of suffering, 12 years of isolation, 12 years of death in life. As dawn broke, she made her decision. Wrapping herself in the heaviest cloak she owned to hide her identity, she formulated her plan. She would not approach him directly. She would not ask for healing aloud. She would simply touch the hem of his garment, the tzitzit, the tassels that religious Jews wore as reminders of God's commandments. One touch, that would be enough. With trembling hands, she prepared herself for the greatest act of courage and faith she had ever attempted. A desperate reach across the chasm of her isolation toward the only hope she had left. The streets were already filling with people when she slipped out of her home. Keeping her head down, she pulled her cloak tighter around her face. Every step brought pain, her body weakened by years of blood loss and the treatments that had promised healing but delivered only more suffering. In the distance, she could hear the growing commotion. A crowd was gathering, voices raised in excitement. "He's coming this way," someone shouted. The throng surged forward, and she with it, carried along like a leaf in a stream. The crowd was thicker than she had anticipated. A pressing, jostling mass of humanity. For someone who had lived in isolation for so long, the sensation of bodies pressing against her was overwhelming. Panic fluttered in her chest. If anyone recognized her, if anyone knew an unclean woman was among them, make way for Jairus. The crowd parted as one of the synagogue rulers pushed through, desperation etched on his face. She overheard fragments of conversation. His daughter was dying. He was seeking Jesus to heal her. The irony wasn't lost on her. A man of religious authority openly seeking the help that she must obtain in secret. Then she saw him, Jesus. He didn't look as she had imagined. No radiant light surrounded him. No obvious markers of divinity. He appeared ordinary, a man in simple garments, dusty from travel. Yet there was something in his bearing, in the calm compassion of his eyes, that drew her forward. But reaching him seemed impossible now. The crowd had grown denser as Jesus agreed to follow Jairus to his home. Bodies pressed against her from all sides, jostling, pushing. Her strength, already compromised, began to fail. Each step became a battle against the tide of humanity and her own weakening limbs. "I can't give up," she whispered to herself. "Not when I'm this close." A wave of dizziness washed over her, the familiar warning that her body was reaching its limits. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. If she fainted here, in this crowd, she would be discovered, her identity revealed, the consequences unthinkable. Through sheer force of will, she pushed forward, her eyes fixed on the hem of his garment. The blue-threaded tassels swayed with his movement, tantalizingly close yet impossibly distant. Just one touch, she told herself, the phrase becoming a mantra, a prayer. Just one touch, and I'll be made whole. With each labored step, doubt and hope waged war within her heart. What if nothing happened? What if, after risking everything, she remained broken, bleeding, and unclean? What if this final disappointment extinguished the last ember of hope she had managed to keep alive for 12 long years? But deeper than her doubt, stronger than her fear, was a conviction that defied logic. This man was different. This man was power. This man was her last and only hope. The crowd surged again, and for a brief moment, a path opened before her. It was now or never. The world narrows to this single moment. Her heart pounds in her ears as she lunges forward, arm outstretched. Her trembling fingers graze the edge of his garment, touching the blue-corded tzitzit that dangles from the corner of his robe. In that instant, that infinitesimal space between before and after, something extraordinary happens. Power. Raw, electric, and undeniable power surges through her fingertips, racing up her arm and flooding her entire body. It is like fire and water, like lightning and bomb all at once. She feels it rush to the source of her suffering, feels the bleeding stop, not gradually, not eventually, but immediately. For the first time in 12 years, the constant drain of her life force ceases. Strength flows back into her limbs. The chronic pain that had become her constant companion vanishes. In a heartbeat, she is transformed. She knows, with absolute certainty, that she is healed. Relief floods through her, so intense it nearly brings her to her knees. She begins to back away, ready to disappear into the crowd, to savor her miracle in private. But then, who touched my clothes? Jesus has stopped. The entire procession halts. His disciples look at him with bewilderment. You see the people crowding against you. They reply. And yet you ask, who touched me? But Jesus continues looking around, scanning the faces in the crowd. He knows. Somehow he knows. Power has gone out from me, he says. Terror grips her heart. She has been caught. Not just touching a rabbi while unclean, but drawing power from him without permission. She could deny it. She could slip away. But something in his searching gaze holds her in place. The crowd falls silent, waiting. All eyes follow Jesus' gaze as it settles on her trembling form. There is nowhere to hide, no escape from this moment of truth. With legs shaking beneath her, she steps forward. Then, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what has happened, she falls to her knees before him. The crowd gasps, recognizing her now, the woman with the issue of blood, the unclean one in their midst. I touched you, she confesses, her voice barely audible. Then, as if a dam has broken, words pour forth, 12 years of suffering condensed into a desperate testimony. She tells him everything. The endless bleeding, the failed treatments, the social exile, the desperate hope that led her to reach for his garment, and the immediate healing she experienced. She awaits his judgment, his rebuke for defiling him with her unclean touch. What comes instead transforms her second time. Jesus looks down at her, his eyes filled not with condemnation, but with compassion. Daughter, he says, the word itself, a healing balm, an acknowledgement of kinship, a belonging. Your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Daughter, not woman, not sinner, not unclean one. Daughter. In that single word, Jesus restores not just her physical health, but her identity, her place in the family of God. And he does this publicly, before the very community that had shunned her. The same people who had avoided her touch now witness her being claimed by the touch of God. The crowd that had been pressing forward toward Jairus' house now stands in stunned silence. They have just witnessed not one miracle but two, a body healed and a soul restored. As Jesus continues on his way to attend to Jairus' daughter, the woman remains kneeling, tears streaming down her face. But these are not tears of shame or sorrow. They are tears of liberation. The bleeding has stopped. The isolation has ended. The long night of her suffering has given way to the dawn of a new life. In reaching for the hem of his garment, she had found not just healing for her body, but the very heart of God. The sun casts long shadows across the marketplace as she walks through it the next day. Head high, steps steady. Eyes that once avoided her now watch and wonder. Whispers follow her, but they're different now. Is it really her? Is she truly healed? Did the rabbi from Nazareth do this? For the first time in 12 years, she moves through the world not as a shadow, but as a fully present being. The ritual bath of purification, the mikveh, has been performed. The required offerings have been made. She is clean in the eyes of both religion and society. But something deeper has changed within her, something beyond physical healing or ritual purification. In that moment when Jesus called her daughter, a fundamental shift occurred in her understanding of God. The deity she had known as distant lawgiver had revealed himself as intimate healer. The God whose rules had defined her uncleanness had now defined her by her faith instead. "Your faith has healed you," he had said. Not her perfect observance of the law, not her ritual purity. Her faith, her desperate, risk-everything trust that reached out when logic said to stay hidden. In the days that follow, her story spreads throughout the region. Some hear it as merely another healing tale among many. Others recognize the profound theological statement embedded within it, that God's power responds to faith regardless of ritual status. The divine touch makes clean what was unclean rather than being defiled by it. For Jewish women particularly, her story becomes a whispered hope. Evidence that their value in God's eyes transcends the purity laws that so often marginalize them. If Jesus could call this woman daughter in her moment of ritual defilement, perhaps God's family was broader than they had been taught to believe. The gospel writers would later include her story alongside the raising of Jairus' daughter, two females, one at the beginning of womanhood, one likely near its end, both restored by the same divine power. Matthew, Mark, and Luke would all preserve her tale, ensuring that generations yet unborn would draw courage from her desperate reach. In the early church, as the followers of Jesus struggled to understand how Gentiles, those outside the covenant of Israel, could be included in God's family, her story would stand as testament. Faith, not ritual status, connects human need to divine power. A beautiful hymn emerges in those early Christian communities celebrating her courage. 12 years of pain, 12 years of shame, until the day the healer came. One touch of faith, one touch of grace, restored her to her rightful place. Not law, but love, made whole her soul. The touch that healed has made us whole. For the woman herself, life would never return to what it had been before the bleeding began. Those 12 years had forever altered her. But now, instead of bearing the scars of shame, she carried the story of redemption, a living testimony that God sees the invisible, values the marginalized, and responds to the faith of the desperate. In synagogues where women sat separate from men, in marketplaces where gossip once condemned her, in homes where young girls learned what it meant to be female in a man's world, her story became revolution disguised as miracle, hope clothed in healing. And whenever she heard of another woman suffering as she had suffered, she would go to her, take her hand, and whisper, "Let me tell you about the day I reached for the hem of his garment." Her story echoes across the centuries, speaking directly to our modern hearts. What can we learn from this unnamed woman's journey? First, that our deepest desperation can become the birthplace of our greatest faith. When all human solutions fail, we discover what it truly means to trust God. Sometimes it's only when we've exhausted every other option that we finally reach for the hem of his garment. Second, that no social barrier, no religious rule, no sense of unworthiness should prevent us from approaching Jesus. The very things that made her untouchable in society's eyes were precisely what drove her to the healer. Our greatest weaknesses, our deepest shame, our most persistent struggles, these are not disqualifications but invitations to experience God's touch. Finally, her story teaches us that Jesus doesn't just heal our bodies, he restores our identities. He called her daughter before all those who had rejected her. He acknowledged her worth when society had deemed her worthless. And he does the same for us today. If you've ever felt invisible, unworthy, or beyond healing, if you've ever wondered if your faith is strong enough or your approach to God acceptable enough, remember the woman who reached through the crowd. Remember that Jesus felt her touch among countless others. Remember that one desperate act of faith changed everything.